Hi everyone, welcome to the latest video of The Break. Today we'll be talking about the New York Certification of Compliance. Tax day is coming up in April, which also means it's the New York DFS cyber regulation filing deadline, which is why we're making this video. I'm Clare Irvine. I'm the Government Affairs Counsel here at PI Northeast, and leading today's break video, we have Brad Lachut, our Director of Government and Industry Affairs. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brad.
Thank you very much, Claire. Yes, as you mentioned, April 15th is fast approaching, and that is the deadline to file the certification of compliance for New York's cybersecurity regulation. So if you are a covered entity in New York, which I'll get to in a second, you need to know about this. So just quickly, let's go over the regulation in a nutshell. We've talked about it before on the break. You've probably read about it elsewhere, hopefully. Hopefully, if you have to comply with it, you know about it. But just briefly, it applies to covered entities. In short, covered entities is anybody who has a license in New York, resident or non-resident. They're referred to covered entities in the regulations. So that's the term I'll use throughout here. There's a couple steps that covered entities need to do. They need to conduct a risk assessment. They need to create a cybersecurity program and policy. And then for the purposes of this break, they also need to file some documents with the New York State Department of Financial Services. There's two things that need to be filed. One, a notice of exemption, which is a one-time only. When you first get into compliance with the regulation, you file your notice of exemption. There's also a certification of compliance. That's what we're going to be talking about today. That requirement is an annual one. So quickly, with the certification of compliance, as I mentioned, it's an annual requirement. Unlike the exemption filing that was only one time only, this one you have to do every year. And Claire had mentioned taxes. That's a good comparison to make for two reasons. One, it's got to be completed by April 15th, tax day, or at least normally, in a normal year. Also, like your taxes, it's backwards looking. So you're filing compliance for the previous year. So in this case, you're doing compliance for the year 2020 in the year 2021. So you're going to look back and make sure you're in compliance in the year prior. And this must be completed by all applicable covered entities. I say applicable because there's some individuals that this is not going to apply to. I'll talk about that in a second. But be aware that if you have multiple license numbers, you might have to file more than one certification of compliance depending on the license. And I'll get into that again. So quickly on the exemptions, who doesn't need to file this certification of compliance? It really is only one subset of covered entities, and that would be employees of agencies. Since they are already covered under the information security plan of an agency, it'll be the agency filing the certification of compliance for the employee. So they're exempt. They don't need to file for the agency. If you are an agency employee and don't need to file, you can stop watching this now if you'd like to. I would suggest you forward it on to the person who does need to file so they know this information. But if you are an employee, you do not need to file. Now, those who are filing for the agency, be aware that you need to make sure that your employees are correctly filed under your agency. So if you've had changes in employees, people leave, people are coming on, make sure you've included them in any exemption that you have, because if they're not, that employee could be in a violation, because if they're not covered under another covered entity's information security program, and you evidence that by filing the exemption, then they would have to file the certification of compliance. So make sure all your employees are covered under the exemption and are filed correctly with DFS. Now, getting on actually to the filing and the certification of compliance, it's pretty straightforward. If you have done this before in the past, if you filed an exemption in the past, or if you filed a notice of a breach in the past, you know where to start. Everything starts at the Dfs Portal. There's a link below to that portal. All you got to do is click on there. You're going to log in, put in your username and password for DFS. So make sure you have that handy before you log in. You're going to be taken to a screen with three banners: one that says exemption, one that says certification, and one that says notice of an event. You're going to want to do the one in the middle, the compliance one. Then you want to find your entity. For this, you're going to want to have your New York State license number handy and have all of your license numbers handy that are going to be applicable. So if you have more than one agency license number, have all of those handy, because you're going to have to file a certification for each one of those licenses. Now, the ones you're not going to have to file for are your personal licenses. Again, that would be covered under the exemption. So just to be clear, the agency license numbers are the only ones that you're really going to be concerned about. And then you're going to actually get to the filing part where you're going to put your information and say, yes, we are in compliance with this. Now, there's three options here, and it's going to depend on how the covered entity is set up. There's an option to file for a board of directors, for senior officers, or for self. If you're a corporation with a board of directors, you're going to be filing under that. If you're an agency, you're filing under an agency license and not your own, then you're probably going to be filing under senior officers. Probably the majority of individuals will be filing under the senior officer header or tag. So if you're the principal filing for agency, senior officer. And then there's also self, and that's going to be for the sole props who might be using their own personal license to write insurance and not have an agency license as well. That's when you want to do self. Again, most people are probably going to do senior officer, maybe board of directors if that's how you're set up, but only self if you do not have an agency license that you're operating under or some other, larger license. So that's really it in a nutshell. It's pretty straightforward. There also is a nice FAQ directions that DFS has on their site that is linked here as well. But I encourage you to take a look at that. That'll help. Of course, if you do have any questions on this or want help with the filing, you can give us a call, myself or Claire or the Resource Center. We'd be happy to help. So with that, hopefully this was informative. I'll turn it back over to Claire for any questions, and then we'll conclude. So Claire.
The one question I'd have is when agency principals or the person for the agency filing this license is preparing it, is there anything they have to do on an annual basis to update their cybersecurity system to remain in compliance?
That's a great question. So yes and no. So the regulation in classic regulation fashion does not specify when an update of your system must be done and that sort of thing. It basically says whenever you so choose or whenever it's practical. So I would encourage all agencies to at least review their policy and plan annually. You don't necessarily need to update it, but you should take a look at it and see if there's any glaring holes. And then set yourself maybe a reminder every couple of years. Do another assessment, redo the whole thing because things change. In addition, if you have any changes within your agency, new management software, new hardware, new computers, or a huge fleet of new employees, or people are now remote, for example, you might need to do a new risk assessment. Anytime the risk changes under the regulation, you're supposed to do a new risk assessment. So if there has been a change, like employees working remotely or new hardware, things like that, another risk assessment should be done. But again, the regulation does not require it every 6 months or every year or whatever.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.